Hi, thank you so much, Cindy. So many of you who are listening may be familiar with our research in Jen McIntyre's lab on the toxicity of 6-PPD-Quinone to coho salmon. So I began working with Jen back in 2016, back when the fish lab was just being built from the ground up. And so over the years, I've really seen how this lab has grown into the important research center that it is today. And now, while I'm finishing up my PhD in the School of the Environment here at WSU, based in Puyallup, I'm currently working for the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation as their graduate level toxics intern. And I'm helping them to create a new toxicology program that's part of their Energy and Environmental Sciences Department. I am a tribal member. I'm a member of the Nome Eskimo community and the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. So these may be formal ways that I identify my membership and as a Native person. But some of the Indian communities that claim me as family are the Peterson family from the Skokomish Indian tribe here in Washington State, where I lived for 8 years just before returning to grad school, and it's where my daughter is enrolled. Also, the Blair family from the Grand Island Band of Ojibwe on the southern shore of Lake Superior, and the Perro family from Garden River First Nation in Ontario, which is on the eastern shore of Lake Superior. So what I wanted to share today was the research that I've been completing as a part of my dissertation work on the toxic mode of action of 6-PPD-Quinone, which includes the lethal and the sublethal effects on the blood-brain barrier of Pacific salmon. And then the other half of my work, as I've been thinking a lot about the toxicity of urban stormwater, is to reflect on my experiences as a Native academic researcher in aquatic toxicology, and to start having conversations within our own tribal communities about how we can develop programs that are tribally led. And I was lucky enough to land at Umatilla, where a lot of this groundwork has already been laid for us to identify ways that we can build tribal academic partnerships to assist tribes in addressing contaminant threats to salmon habitat and other first foods. So over the 8 years or so that I've been thinking and speaking about problems related to urban runoff, we always start with some type of figure that looks like this. And I found this meme and I thought it was a more funnier way of looking at these issues. But this is how we explain how, urban development creates these water quantity and these water quality problems. We create these impervious surfaces that don't behave like the forest that they paved over. And so these are the types of challenges that we have to address today. And what's always struck me about how we start these conversations is that there's an assumption that urban development in the Pacific Northwest was an inevitable part of our past, that there was no way that we could have known the negative consequences of urban development and how they would impact salmon, alongside with the other forms of development like agricultural development and logging and forestry practices that have degraded salmon habitat and led to the salmon declines and extinctions that we see today. It's often framed that urban stormwater is a modern problem that requires modern approaches and tools and technology to solve. But as David Montgomery points out in his book called King of Fish, The 1,000-Year Run of Salmon, by the 1800s, salmon were already in a steady decline across Europe due to these same deforestation and logging practices, the building of dams, overfishing, and pollution problems. And this was all despite measures that were taken to protect Atlantic salmon because they were a highly valued natural resource. Any measures to protect Atlantic salmon really failed because the causes of salmon declines, as Montgomery points out in his book, weren't due to the lack of adequate knowledge or science or technology, but it was a failure of Western European social and political systems that were based on individual property land ownership rights with exclusive rights to extract natural resources, and the development of the tools and technology and infrastructures that made these practices increasingly more profitable for short-term gain. And it was well known at the time that the treaties were signed and development was taking place here in the Pacific Northwest, that after the lands were acquired and developed, it would lead to the declines of Pacific salmon. It was known that salmon as an abundant resource was exhaustible. But as Lechatowicz writes about in his book called Salmon Without Rivers, the existing social and political systems were really driven by a utilitarian perspective, the greatest good for the greatest number, which favored short-term economic gains from things like timber and mining, grazing and canneries. And these industries had no real interest or stake in keeping salmon habitat intact. Now, enforcement and environmental protections was one issue of those times, but today we still struggle with balancing the inherent uncertainties of natural resource protections with the relative certainty of economic gains and losses. So in the same year that Puget Sound Chinook were listed under the Endangered Species Act, Lechatowicz's work was a call to critically examine our economic and political systems and to ask ourselves how we can change them to operate within the bounds of natural systems so that we don't keep repeating the same regrettable cycles of overexploitation and too little and too late natural resource protections. And as a research scientist, I'm trying to think about the goal of achieving environmental protection through the lens of reducing scientific uncertainties. But as an Ojibwe or Anishinaabe scientist, I'm also very aware of the astounding richness of our political and intellectual traditions that gave rise to the incredible abundance of natural systems that colonists and settlers saw when they arrived. Because our cultural traditions reach back over thousands of years of careful observations of how natural systems functioned and how they evolved, we knew how to live within those systems and how to make them even more abundant. And this is how we defined our sovereignty. It wasn't a declaration of our right to take salmon. It was our responsibility of stewardship and the caretaking that we took not only of the land and salmon, but also of our communities. And so coming to work for a tribal natural resource department, I never liked the term natural resource management because it didn't seem fitting for a tribal perspective. Because once you call something a resource, it becomes something that can be exploited. But natural resource management to me is really about how we manage ourselves. So this is why tribal sovereignty and treaty rights are inextricably linked to addressing issues like stormwater. Because since time immemorial, our tribal economies, our ethical frameworks, our political systems, and our cultures were created to operate within the natural systems of the land. So the salmon crisis, the climate crisis, the pollution crisis, these are all important incentives for the US and Canada to make the necessary adjustments to come closer to a state of political and social reform. And they may not yet have these political and social systems worked out for themselves. They can hold themselves accountable to what they will be in the future by holding themselves accountable to tribal sovereignty and by keeping the promises that were made in the treaty agreements. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the case United States versus Washington, known as the Bolt decision. And this was really an important turning point for both salmon and for tribal sovereignty. In those decades that were leading up to the Bolt decision in 1974, Native people were largely viewed by the public as a vanishing race after generations of forced assimilation policies, the abrogation of treaty rights, and the termination of tribal sovereignty. And today, treaty rights is considered now a powerful tool for the protection of salmon because tribes really refuse to give up their way of life. The late legal scholar of American Indian law, Charles Wilkinson, wrote about the Bolt decision in his latest book that's called Treaty Justice, where he said, quote, "Tribal sovereignty is one of the most powerful and valuable public ideas that has ever touched my mind. The world's most powerful nation tried to terminate tribal sovereignty over the course of many generations, but could not because it meant so much to Indian people and they refused to give in." End quote. And as a soon-to-be graduate of an environmental and natural resource science doctoral program at WSU, I am of the belief that it should be required for all students to take a course on U.S. tribal relations that explains the historical context for what led up to the Bolt decision, when tribes were now recognized as co-managers of the fisheries. This isn't necessarily our history as tribal people. This is the history of the United States and their natural resource management. So in my mind, leaving this history out of these programs leaves students underprepared to work with tribes when they enter into natural resource fields, and it perpetuates the false thinking that treaty rights and tribal sovereignty are issues that are either solved or they're in the past. And at the very minimum, all students should come away with a basic understanding that when the Stevens Treaties were signed, nearly all of the harvestable salmon were taken by the tribes. And tribes refused to sign the treaties unless it was guaranteed that salmon would continue to be their source of economic and cultural prosperity. And so they reserved the rights of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places on ceded lands. That was the original intention, but since tribes were severely disadvantaged in the treaty negotiations, they almost immediately were excluded from the fisheries and access to fishing sites. In ongoing court cases, it was affirmed through cases like U.S. versus Taylor that established the canon of treaty construction that treaties must be liberally construed in favor of Indians because of their disadvantaged status. And then also in the Winans case, it established that they did in fact reserve off-reservation treaty rights. Despite these court decisions, by the late 1960s and 1970s, tribes were harvesting only 2 to 5% of the salmon, and the state of Washington sought to further limit tribal fisheries under the guise of conservation. It was due to judges like Judge Bolt and other judges ruling similar decisions at the time that these exposed the types of discriminatory practices that were being proposed by the state, and they put into the historical context of the treaties into perspective when they reached the decision that tribes were entitled to 50% of the fishery harvest, including hatchery fish, and that they must be recognized as co-managers alongside state and federal agencies. Phase 2 of the Bolt decision dealt with the question of the state's responsibility to ensure that fishery stocks needed to exist in the first place for the tribes to receive their apportionment that was guaranteed in the treaty agreements. Judge Oreck's opinion on this issue was that there indeed was an implicit right for salmon habitat protection, but the U.S. Supreme Court at the time wanted to wait until the habitat question could be decided once the tribes could bring forward a specific habitat issue where it could be decided what the state's obligations were under the treaty agreements. In the early 2000s, the issue brought before the continuation of the Bolt decision was known as the Culverts case. And the Supreme Court upheld in 2018 that indeed there was an implicit right to protect salmon habitat within the treaty agreements that required Washington state to take reasonable action so as not to deplete this resource. Now today, salmon face numerous threats to their habitat, which includes threats from urban development, from climate change, and from chemical pollution. And treaties today are now recognized as powerful protections for salmon habitat, as they rightfully should be. Treaties are negotiated between two sovereign nations. The United States federal government recognized the sovereignty of tribes, and the tribes recognized the sovereignty of the United States when the treaties were signed. The tribes gave up something that was incredibly substantial, all of the land that the U.S. was built on. And in return, the tribes secured something as equally as valuable, which was the right to salmon habitat protection to ensure the ability of the harvest so that enough salmon could be supported to make a moderate living, as well as an obligation on the part of the federal and state governments to take reasonable steps to preserve and to enhance fisheries resources. So the toxicity research that we're involved here at WSU Puyallup, this is at the center of this discussion on what are considered reasonable steps that the states are obligated to through the treaty agreements to protect coho salmon and other vulnerable species from the threats of roadway runoff pollution. In 2020, our partners at University of Washington-Tacoma identified 6-PPD-Quinone as the causal contaminant coming from tires and tire wear particles that have been the driving factor in recurrent die-offs of coho salmon in urban streams. And very likely, it's been a contributing factor to extinctions of coho salmon in heavily urbanized watersheds and prevented their recovery in streams where significant investment of public dollars have been poured into restoring degraded habitat. 6-PPD-Quinone is one of the most deadly man-made chemicals that's known for aquatic life, more toxic than many organophosphate pesticides that were also designed to kill pests. So when I think of discussions about what to do about 6-PPD-Quinone, I think about the current similarities to the economic arguments that were made in the past. Namely, that we don't require the same level of scientific certainties for industries to demonstrate the safety of the environmental chemicals that they are responsible for releasing, as we seem to require in order to accept the certainty of the economic costs responsible for cleaning them up once they are released. In this way, scientific uncertainty can always be used as a justification to delay taking reasonable actions, just as it did when salmon habitat was destroyed for urban development and logging and agricultural development in riparian zones, and overharvesting by non-tribal fishers since the beginning of the 20th century. And in my mind, it continues to play a role in how quickly we will make tires safe for salmon through finding a replacement for 6-PPD. Now, the toxicity of 6-PPD-Quinone to aquatic species is a rapidly evolving field, and my area of study focuses on the mode of action. In my research, I demonstrated that the blood-brain barrier is broken down in juvenile coho that are exposed to roadway runoff. And so this figure is showing brain sections from coho that were exposed to clean water on the left and to roadway runoff on the right. And here we can see the extensive brown staining that indicates every region of the runoff exposed coho brain where these vessels are leaking due to exposure to 6-PPD-Quinone. In a normal, healthy, functioning brain, the blood-brain barrier is nearly impermeable to constituents that flow through the blood, and it actively transports into the central nervous system the things in the blood that those functional tissues need, and then excretes the waste products. Structurally, the blood-brain barrier is composed of endothelial cells that form the blood vessel walls of the brain capillaries, which are firmly sealed together by tight junctions. These endothelial cells are surrounded and supported by several types of supporting cells that also compose the blood-brain barrier. And in cases of brain injury, infection, hypoxia, or exposure to certain toxicants, this blood-brain barrier can be disrupted and opened so that blood plasma constituents can freely diffuse into the central nervous system. And this is how it damages neurons, impedes signaling, and can lead to death. In my studies with coho, I inject tracers of different sized molecular weights through the fish's heart, and I let them circulate in the blood. If those tracers accumulate in the brain, it tells us that the blood-brain barrier was disrupted, and we can roughly measure the size of that opening through different sized molecular weight tracers to assess its severity. And using a combination of high and low molecular weight circulating tracers, we confirmed that juvenile coho that were exposed to similar concentrations of 6-PPD-Quinone to those found in roadway runoff also showed blood-brain barrier disruption. So these figures are showing the quantitative accumulation for the low molecular weight tracer on the left and the high molecular weight tracer on the right. In the control group, they were exposed to clean water, and their intact blood-brain barriers prevented the accumulation of those tracers. So our measurements for those tracers were always close to zero. For all the coho that were exposed to 6-PPD-Quinone and that developed symptoms of surfacing and loss of equilibrium that precede death, those sick coho all showed the accumulation of both the low and high molecular weight tracers, which indicates for blood-brain barrier disruption. Although in this study, we expected all of the coho to become sick within an 8-hour window, 2 of the coho did not show these symptoms, and they did not show evidence of blood-brain barrier disruption. And this is likely due to some individual variability that we see in the time to death or the time to symptom development. But for every fish that does develop these symptoms, we always see the accumulation of these tracers. To investigate triggering events for blood-brain barrier disruption, we began developing RT-qPCR methods to look for changes in the genetic expression of blood-brain barrier-related proteins, and to also evaluate sublethal effects in Chinook salmon that were exposed to 6-PPD-Quinone. So we selected a range of junctional proteins, which serve as the gate between endothelial cells that are involved with blood-brain barrier opening, different types of cytosolic regulatory proteins, and several mediators that may be released from adjacent pericytes and radial glia, those supporting cells, which can also trigger blood-brain barrier opening. And we found that there was significant downregulation in the structural blood-brain barrier genes, claudin 5 alpha, VE cadherins, as well as occludin in juvenile coho that were lethally exposed to 6-PPD-Quinone relative to controls. So this evidence shows us that there are pathways that affect both the tight junctions and the adherence junctions that are responsible for opening the blood-brain barrier. And it's further evidence that the blood-brain barrier is indeed affected by 6-PPD-Quinone. We also found that there were sublethal effects in juvenile Chinook exposed to worst-case scenario concentrations of around 2,000 nanograms per liter of 6-PPD-Quinone for 96 hours. The blood-brain barrier gene, the gene for the protein zonula occludens 1 was significantly downregulated in this study. Since Chinook are tetraploids, they have 4 copies of each gene. So in this RT-qPCR study, we only had the ability to look at 1 version of each gene, which may or may not be the alleles that are responsible for a response to 6-PPD-Quinone. So these methods can continue to be improved, and it's recommended that there's follow-up studies to look into using genetic tools to continue to explore changes in the blood-brain barrier of Chinook salmon as a sublethal effect. And one important benefit of using RT-qPCR methods is that they can be performed on the smaller sub-yearling juveniles, whereas the tracer injection methods have the drawback of they can only be performed on larger yearling juvenile salmon, which may not be necessarily the life history stage of interest for species like fall Chinook. We know that coho salmon are the most sensitive species to 6-PPD-Quinone, but there are lots of other Pacific Northwest species that are possibly at risk. And we know that there is some sensitivity to species such as rainbow or steelhead trout and also coastal cutthroat. And one of the important lessons that has come out of the 6-PPD-Quinone research is that we really generally lack specific toxicity information on the range of ecologically and culturally important species in the Pacific Northwest. This is due to the fact that toxicology work is performed on usually non-native model species like fathead minnows or zebrafish, and these can be less sensitive to chemicals than our native species, but they're easier to raise in the lab, and they're more of a standard model. So therefore, water quality criteria may not really be protective for our native species if they're mostly based on data collected from these non-native model species. At the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation, which includes the Umatilla, Cayuse, and Walla Walla tribes, their natural resource department is really centered on protecting first foods as the driving policy for how they approach management in this department. And so their mission goal is very clearly stated: to protect, restore, and enhance the first foods, water, salmon, deer, hausch, and huckleberry, for the perpetual cultural, economic, and sovereign benefit of CTUIR. We will accomplish this utilizing traditional ecological and cultural knowledge and science to inform population and habitat management goals and actions, and natural resource policies and regulatory mechanisms. Now, the Longhouse is the center of the community at CTUIR, and first foods are served at community gatherings following traditional protocols that's known as the serving order, where a small piece of each of these foods is offered as thanks, and it's eaten in a particular order to honor their creation story and their responsibility to care for the water and the plants and animals. In these stories, the creator gathered all of the plants and animals together and told them that people would be coming to the land, but they would not know how to live here. So creator asked each one of them, "Who of you will take care of them?" And at first, the plants and animals were unsure about these new people. They didn't know if they really wanted to accept them. So the salmon was the first to step up and promised his body and his knowledge. And then after salmon stepped up, the rest of the fish lined up behind salmon. Next came the deer and the other game animals. And then came hausch and the other roots. And then came the huckleberry and the other berries lined up behind them. These foods are recognized for their promises to take care of the people. And in return, the people were given instructions to respectfully use and take care of these first foods. According to the United States, we as tribes are considered domestic dependent nations, but in our creation stories, we know that we're not dependent on the United States. We're dependent on our first foods. If we were to suddenly disappear, all of the plants and the animals would carry on very well without us. But if the plants and animals were to disappear, we would not survive. We recognize the personhood of plants and animals, not corporations, and our creation stories remind us to live according to the treaty relationship that we have with them. A treaty relationship means a reciprocal relationship of mutual benefit, where both parties have rights and responsibilities to maintain a peaceful coexistence. If the US and Canada are going to learn how to live according to a sustainable and reciprocal relationship with the land, they must first honor the treaty agreements with the tribes, which have not been treated as agreements of mutual benefit, but instead have been identified as one of a profound taking from Indian people, as well as from the land. Another form of taking is the taking of knowledge. For 500 years, Native people have been told that their traditional and ecological knowledges were primitive, were inferior to Western knowledge, backwards, and even evil. We were told that because our homelands were so abundant and plentiful with first foods, we were wasting these resources and not putting them to their proper use. And so they needed to be taken from us so that we could be shown how to live a civilized lifestyle. Today, we're in the process of decolonizing our thinking around traditional and ecological knowledge, and its value is becoming more widely accepted, but there still are many issues around how it may be used in educational institutions. In order to grow tribally led toxicology programs to co-manage contaminant issues alongside federal and state agencies, we need our people to have access to higher education that leaves intact their community and land-based connections that are the source of these traditional knowledges. The source of traditional knowledge can never be the universities because the knowledge cannot be removed from the land and from the community. Our cultural protocols tell us that we have to be gathering our first foods if we want to know how to take care of them. Now, American Indians and Alaska Natives continue to be the lowest represented ethnic groups among graduates of doctoral programs. And while DEI initiatives are making academia more hospitable and more accessible to other underrepresented minorities, doctoral programs are seen as places that are still exclusionary, extractive, and unattainable for many Native people. The academic institutions themselves need to make fundamental shifts in their approach to how knowledge is produced and how it's valued, and how Native students are supported, and to increase representation of Native scholars with community-based knowledge. Universities should also partner with tribal colleges and tribes to create research programs that are community-based and focused. And so that is our hope for the newly formed CTUIR Toxics program. And here our goal is to create a K through PhD pathway for Native youth from the community to increase their access to first foods, to study contaminant issues that threaten first foods and community health, and to have a system of financial support and mentorship to carry Native students through the university systems to learn the skills and expertise that's needed to address these contaminant threats, while at the same time remaining rooted in their communities and recognizing the knowledge gained from continuing traditional practices is just as important, if not more important, than the knowledge that's gained from within academic institutions, and should be formally recognized as such on the part of the universities and reflected in their programs of study. A CTUIR program has been really well thought out, and I stepped in just this year as their graduate level intern to start developing mentorship programs for undergraduates and Native youth, as well as to develop a toxics chemical inventory and strategic plan for the new program. First Foods, they teach us how to establish the proper relationships that are based on principles of respect, reciprocity, and self-determination. And these are principles that form the basis for everything that we do as Native people, including the ways that we engage with both Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. The serving order reminds us that water is served first and last because water is to be profoundly respected. Water is the most important of the first foods. Today, we're grappling with these ongoing battles to try and learn from the regrettable decisions of the past to prevent further losses of Pacific salmon and to transition to a state of recovery. The tools and technologies may be different from the past in how we move across the land, how we harvest, how we manage our natural resources, but our traditional values and the principles we live by have not changed. Through the recognition of treaty rights and tribal sovereignty, tribes have an ever-growing influence on co-management strategies to tackle issues like stormwater runoff and 6PPD-Quinone toxicity. And at CTUIR, we're just at the beginning of figuring out how to build a strong network of universities with tribal partners and interagency partnerships to use First Foods as the framework for how we identify contaminant threats and how we draw on both traditional ecological and Western scientific knowledges to respond and how to care for our first foods. So with that, I'd like to say special thanks to David Trout from the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Lisa Rosman from the Washington Stormwater Center, and to the Water Research Center for supporting our work on the toxicity of 6-PPD-Quinone, but also being very forward-thinking in approaches to how we develop tribally led toxics programs. And I want to thank, the many people who have been funders and supporters for our ongoing work. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or also invite Jen if you had any thoughts on the work that we have done.